Hello, dear sleepyheads. Tonight we journey back to the heart of ancient Rome, to walk in the footsteps of Julius Caesar, beneath marble arches and under the golden light of a republic on the edge of change. This is the story of a man who rose from the narrow streets of the city to the heights of power, and whose name would echo across time. Before we begin, I want to thank you for being here. If you find peace in these stories, a like or subscription means the world to me. It helps me bring more of these quiet journeys through history to you. And now, let us begin. In the soft morning light of ancient Rome, when the cobblestones still held the coolness of night, and the first vendors were arranging their wares in the market squares, there lived a boy who would one day change the world. The year was around 100 BCE, and in the Subura district, where narrow alleys wound between modest homes and the scent of baking bread drifted from doorways, Gaius Julius Caesar drew his first breath. The Subura was not the grand Palatine Hill where senators built their marble villas, nor was it the bustling Forum where orators held crowds spellbound. It was a neighborhood of ordinary Romans, of shopkeepers and craftsmen, of families who worked with their hands and slept soundly after long days. Yet even here, in these humble streets, the Caesar family carried within their blood the ancient stories of Rome itself. As dawn painted the 7 hills in shades of rose and gold, young Gaius would wake to the gentle sounds of the city stirring to life. The distant call of merchants announcing their goods, the soft clip-clop of donkeys carrying water up from the Tiber, the whispered prayers from household shrines, where small offerings of bread and wine honored the gods who watched over Roman homes. These were the sounds that shaped his earliest memories, the rhythm of a city that pulsed with the steady heartbeat of an ancient civilization. His mother, Aurelia, would tell him stories as she combed his dark hair in the morning light. Stories of their ancestor, Aeneas, who had fled burning Troy and sailed across wine-dark seas to found the Roman line. Stories of Romulus and Remus, suckled by a she-wolf on the banks of the Tiber. These tales were more than entertainment. They were the threads that wove together the fabric of Roman identity, the sacred narratives that connected every citizen to something greater than themselves. And so the story flows on, as young Caesar grew beneath the watchful eyes of the household gods, his mind already quick with questions that would one day reshape the world. The Caesar family, though not wealthy, possessed something far more valuable in Roman society: pedigree. They traced their lineage back through the mists of legend to Venus herself, the goddess of love and beauty. This divine connection was more than mere boasting. It was a source of gravitas, the weight of ancestral dignity that Romans valued above gold. When Caesar's father would take him to the Forum on festival days, pointing out the statues of great men and the temples where their ancestors had once served, the boy would feel the pull of destiny like a gentle current in a quiet stream. The Forum Romanum in those days was a place of wonder that unfolded like a marble dream beneath the Mediterranean sun. Great columns rose toward the heavens, their surfaces carved with stories of triumph and sacrifice. The Temple of Vesta, where sacred flames flickered eternally, cast dancing shadows across polished stones. Citizens in togas moved with unhurried dignity between the basilicas where justice was dispensed, and the markets where goods from across the known world changed hands with soft clinks of silver coins. Here, young Caesar would listen to the orators practicing their craft, their voices rising and falling like music as they spoke of law and honor, of duty to the state and the gods. The Latin words flowed like honey, each syllable carefully chosen, each pause deliberate as morning mist. He would watch how a skilled speaker could hold hundreds of people in perfect silence, how the right word at the right moment could move hearts and change minds. These lessons, absorbed in childhood, like sunlight soaking into stone, would serve him well in years to come. In time, the path led him onward to formal education, where Caesar proved himself a student of exceptional promise. Roman boys of good family were expected to master not only Latin, but Greek as well, for the conquered Greeks had become the teachers of their Roman conquerors in matters of philosophy, rhetoric, and the finer arts. Caesar's tutor, a patient Greek freedman named Marcus Antonius Gniffo, would arrive each morning as the household stirred to life, carrying scrolls of Homer and Cicero like precious treasures. Under the gentle guidance of his teacher, Caesar learned to read the flowing lines of the Iliad, where heroes strode across sun-scorched plains, and the gods themselves took sides in mortal conflicts. He studied the intricate arguments of Plato, where questions led to more questions in an endless spiral of wonder. Most importantly, he practiced the art of rhetoric, learning to weave words into patterns that could persuade, inspire, and command. His voice, even as a youth, carried a quality that made others stop and listen, a natural authority that seemed to flow from some deeper source. The afternoons often found him in the Campus Martius, the great field outside the city walls where Roman youth learned the arts of war. Here, beneath the vast Italian sky, Caesar would practice with wooden swords alongside boys who would one day fight beside him in distant lands. The instructors were grizzled veterans who had served in the legions, men who spoke of discipline and courage not as abstract virtues, but as practical necessities for survival. Caesar proved himself naturally gifted with the weapons, his movements flowing like water, even as he learned the precise techniques of Roman swordplay. But more than his physical skills, it was his ability to inspire others that set him apart. When the boys were divided into mock armies for training battles, Caesar would often find himself chosen as leader, not through force or bluster, but through a quiet confidence that made others want to follow. And so the story flows on, as the boy became a young man, beneath the endless blue of Roman skies, his character taking shape like clay in the hands of a master sculptor. When Caesar reached his 16th year, the time came for him to assume the toga of manhood in a ceremony as old as Rome itself. On the appointed day, as the morning sun cast long shadows across the city, he walked with his family to the Forum, leaving behind the bordered toga of childhood for the pure white garment that marked him as a citizen with full rights and responsibilities. The ceremony was simple, yet profound. Before the household gods, Caesar formally declared his readiness to serve the state. His father placed the new toga around his shoulders, while Aurelia whispered prayers to the goddesses who watched over young men at the threshold of adulthood. The weight of the fabric felt different from his childhood clothes, heavier somehow, as if it carried within its folds all the expectations of his ancestors. That same year brought changes that would ripple through Caesar's life like stones dropped in still water. His father arranged his betrothal to Cosutia, daughter of a wealthy equestrian family. It was a practical match, designed to strengthen both families' positions in Roman society. Young men of Caesar's class understood that marriage was primarily a matter of politics and property, not personal affection, though many couples did grow to love each other over time. Yet as Caesar entered his 17th year, the political winds of Rome began to shift in ways that would alter his destiny forever. The great general Gaius Marius, who had reformed the Roman legions and won victories that expanded the empire's borders, had recently died. His political heir was a man named Lucius Cornelius Cinna, who controlled Rome with an iron fist wrapped in the velvet glove of legal procedure. Cinna, perhaps recognizing something special in the young Caesar, or perhaps simply seeking to bind another noble family to his cause, arranged for Caesar to marry his daughter Cornelia. This was not merely a personal matter, but a political statement, for Cinna represented the populares, the faction that claimed to speak for the common people against the optimates, the aristocratic party that defended traditional privileges. The wedding took place on a gentle spring morning when the air was soft with the promise of new growth. Cornelia, barely 14, moved through the ceremony with the grave dignity expected of a Roman bride, her face veiled in the traditional flame-colored palla. Caesar, now 18, spoke his vows with a solemnity that impressed even the most cynical observers. As they joined hands before the household altar, neither could have imagined the trials that lay ahead. In time, the path led him onward into the dangerous currents of Roman politics, where a single misstep could mean exile or death. The marriage to Cornelia brought Caesar more than a wife. It brought him to the attention of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Marius's greatest enemy and the leader of the Optimates. Sulla had been away from Rome, fighting wars in the east, but his return was anticipated with the mixture of hope and dread that Romans reserved for the return of conquering generals. When news came that Sulla had landed in Italy with his legions, the political temperature in Rome began to rise like heat from sun-baked stones. Caesar found himself caught between the grinding millstones of Roman civil war. His connections to Cinna's faction marked him as a potential enemy of Sulla, yet his noble birth and obvious talents made him too valuable to simply eliminate. As Sulla's forces approached Rome, many of Cinna's supporters fled the city or made hasty accommodations with the coming victor. Caesar chose a different path. On a morning when autumn mist clung to the Tiber like gossamer veils, Caesar received a summons that would test his character as surely as any battle. Sulla, now master of Rome, commanded him to divorce Cornelia and make a more politically acceptable marriage. The ultimatum was delivered by one of Sulla's lieutenants, a hard-faced man who spoke with the casual authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Standing in the atrium of his modest home, with Cornelia beside him and the household gods looking down from their shrine, Caesar gave his answer with quiet dignity. He would not divorce his wife. The consequences of this refusal were made clear: loss of his inheritance, exclusion from public office, and quite possibly death if Sulla decided to make an example of him. That night, as Rome slept uneasily under its new master, Caesar made a decision that revealed the steel beneath his courteous exterior. Rather than submit or flee, he would go into temporary exile, removing himself from Rome until the political climate changed. It was a gamble that required both courage and patience, qualities that would serve him well in the years to come. And so, the story flows on, as the young man learned that sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing when to bend before the storm. Caesar's exile took him across the wine-dark waters of the Mediterranean to the island of Rhodes, where Greek scholars had established schools of rhetoric and philosophy that attracted ambitious young Romans. The journey itself was a revelation, for Caesar had never before travelled beyond the familiar hills of Latium. As his ship cut through the gentle swells, dolphins playing in its wake, he watched Italy fade into the haze of distance and felt the exhilaration of a wider world opening before him. Rhodes in those days was a place where East met West in harmonious blend. The harbour was crowded with vessels from every corner of the Mediterranean. Egyptian grain ships with their distinctive curved prows, Phoenician traders laden with purple dye and exotic spices, sleek warships from various Greek cities displaying their bronze rams like badges of honour. The city itself rose in terraces from the water's edge, its white buildings gleaming like scattered pearls against the deep blue of sea and sky. Here, Caesar studied under some of the finest teachers of his age, men who had inherited the wisdom of Aristotle and Demosthenes. His Greek, already good, became fluent as poetry. His understanding of philosophy deepened from mere academic exercise to genuine wisdom about the nature of power, justice, and human ambition. Most importantly, his skills as an orator reached new heights as he learned to blend the passionate eloquence of Greek rhetoric with the practical directness of Roman law. The peaceful routine of study was interrupted one day by an event that would become legendary. Caesar had booked passage on a small merchant vessel bound for Miletus, intending to visit the famous oracle of Apollo at nearby Didyma. As the ship sailed through the scattered islands of the Dodecanese, its captain keeping close to shore in the ancient manner, they were suddenly surrounded by sleek galleys flying no flag and manned by fierce-looking crews. Pirates had been the scourge of the Mediterranean for generations, their swift ships striking without warning and vanishing like sea mist. They demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver for Caesar's release, a sum that reflected their assessment of his worth as the scion of a noble Roman family. Caesar's reaction became the stuff of legend. He laughed at the low figure and insisted they raise it to 50 talents, claiming they clearly didn't know who they had captured. During the weeks of his captivity on a small rocky island, Caesar treated his captors more like servants than guards. He demanded they be quiet when he wanted to sleep, critiqued their poor speaking skills, and even wrote poetry that he recited to them whether they wanted to hear it or not. When they showed insufficient appreciation for his verses, he would cheerfully threaten to have them all crucified once he was free. The pirates, accustomed to cowering captives, were completely bewildered by this aristocratic young Roman, who seemed to regard his kidnapping as an amusing inconvenience. The ransom was eventually paid by friends and supporters, but Caesar's promise to return was no idle threat. As soon as he reached the mainland, he gathered a small fleet and returned to the island. The pirates who had made the fatal error of releasing their ships to other waters were easily captured. True to his word, Caesar had them crucified, though he showed mercy by having their throats cut first to spare them the prolonged agony that usually accompanied that form of execution. In time, the path led him onward to even greater adventures, as the young exile began to forge the reputation that would one day shake the world. News from Rome eventually reached Caesar that Sulla had died, his iron grip on the city loosening in death as it never had in life. The political climate was shifting once again, creating opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Caesar's period of exile had served its purpose, giving him not only safety from Sulla's wrath, but also the broader education and worldly experience that would distinguish him from his more provincial rivals. His return to Rome was deliberately understated. He avoided grand gestures or triumphant processions, instead slipping back into the city like morning mist returning to the hills. The Rome he found was subtly different from the one he had left. The harsh certainties of Sulla's dictatorship had given way to the more familiar chaos of republican politics, with competing factions once again maneuvering for advantage through a complex dance of alliances, betrayals, and temporary accommodations. Caesar's first step back into public life came through his appointment as a military tribune, a junior officer's position that allowed him to gain practical experience with the legions. He was assigned to a garrison in Asia Minor, where the eternal problems of provincial administration provided excellent training for a young man destined for greater things. Here, beneath the ancient walls of cities that had known Alexander the Great, Caesar learned the practical arts of command, how to maintain discipline without crushing morale, how to balance the competing interests of Roman settlers and local populations, how to turn raw recruits into soldiers who would follow orders even unto death. The eastern provinces were a revelation to Caesar. In Rome, he had known himself as a member of an ancient and noble family, but here he began to understand the true scope of Roman power. From Britain in the fog-shrouded north to Egypt in the sun-scorched south, from the Atlantic shores of Spain to the mountains of Armenia, Rome's eagles cast their shadows over peoples who had never heard the Latin tongue or worshipped the gods of the Seven Hills. Yet it was not just the extent of Roman power that impressed him, but its limitations. The empire was held together by force, certainly, but also by the consent of the governed, by the promise that Roman rule brought peace, prosperity, and justice. When that promise was broken, as it sometimes was by corrupt governors or brutal generals, rebellion followed as surely as thunder follows lightning. Caesar began to understand that true power came not from fear alone, but from the ability to make others want to be ruled. His service in the East was distinguished, but not spectacular. He showed courage in minor skirmishes, wisdom in dealing with local disputes, and an unusual interest in the welfare of the common soldiers under his command. Veterans who served with him in those days would later remember how he would walk among the campfires in the evening, learning the men's names and listening to their concerns. It was a style of leadership that seemed natural to him, as if he genuinely cared about the lives and opinions of men far beneath him in social rank. And so the story flows on, as the young officer learned that empires are built not just by conquest, but by the patient work of administration and the delicate art of earning loyalty. When Caesar returned to Rome after his military service, he found a city buzzing with new possibilities. The rigid structures that Sulla had imposed were cracking under the pressure of competing ambitions, and clever men were finding ways to advance their careers through paths that had been closed for years. Caesar decided to pursue the traditional Roman route to political prominence, the law courts. Roman legal proceedings were public entertainment as much as serious business. Citizens would gather in the forum to hear famous advocates argue cases, cheering for their favorites like spectators at gladiatorial games. A young lawyer who could win difficult cases and sway juries with eloquent speeches might find himself catapulted to fame and political opportunity almost overnight. Caesar's first major case was a prosecution of Gnaeus Cornelius Dolabella, a former governor of Macedonia who was accused of extortion and abuse of power. It was a bold choice for a young advocate, as Dolabella was well connected and defended by some of the finest legal minds in Rome. But Caesar had done his research carefully, gathering testimony from Greek cities that had suffered under Dolabella's rule and assembling evidence of corruption that was impossible to ignore. The trial became the talk of Rome. Caesar's opening statement was delivered with such eloquence and passion that even his opponents acknowledged his skill. He painted a picture of provincial suffering under rapacious Roman rule that moved even hardened senators to sympathy. His Greek witnesses, carefully coached in proper protocol, told their stories with dignity that contrasted sharply with the arrogant dismissals offered by Dolabella's defenders. Though Dolabella was ultimately acquitted, thanks to the influence of his powerful friends, Caesar's reputation was made. The legal community recognized him as a rising star, while the common people appreciated his willingness to take on corrupt officials who thought themselves above the law. More importantly, Caesar had learned valuable lessons about the power of public opinion and the importance of presenting complex issues in ways that ordinary citizens could understand and support. His success in the courts led to his election as quaestor, the first rung on the ladder of Roman political advancement. The position came with administrative duties that might have seemed tedious to some, but Caesar approached them with characteristic energy and attention to detail. He was assigned to further Spain, where he would serve under the praetor Antistius Vetus in managing the province's finances and legal affairs. The journey to Spain took Caesar along the ancient roads that bound the empire together, like arteries carrying the lifeblood of civilization. These roads were marvels of engineering that would endure for centuries. Their stones fitted so perfectly that weeds could barely find purchase between them. As his small entourage made its way across the Pyrenees, Caesar could see below him the vast sweep of Iberian plains, where Roman legions had fought and died to extend the empire's borders. In time, the path led him onward to the realization that Rome's strength lay not in any single great victory, but in the patient accumulation of small successes that eventually became irresistible. Spain in Caesar's day was still partially wild, a land where Roman civilization existed in islands of order, surrounded by vast territories, where tribal customs and ancient loyalties held sway. The cities founded by Roman colonists gleamed with familiar architecture, forums and temples and aqueducts that could have been transplanted from Italy. But venture beyond their walls, and you entered a world where different gods were worshipped and different languages spoken, where warriors still fought with weapons their grandfathers had carried, and where Roman authority was more theoretical than real. Caesar's duties as quaestor required him to travel throughout the province, inspecting tax collection, settling legal disputes, and ensuring that Roman law was properly administered. These journeys gave him an intimate knowledge of how the empire actually functioned at its farthest edges, far from the marble halls of the capital. He learned to work with local chieftains who had accepted Roman rule, to navigate the complex relationships between veteran colonists and native populations, and to judge which battles were worth fighting and which were better avoided. One evening, as Caesar reviewed accounts by lamplight in a modest villa that served as his headquarters, he experienced what he would later describe as one of the most profound moments of his life. A messenger had brought news from Rome, including reports of speeches by various political figures and accounts of recent elections and trials. Among these reports was a description of the latest triumphal procession, where a successful general had paraded his captives and spoils through cheering crowds, while rose petals fell like snow from upper-story windows. The account mentioned that the triumphant general was the same age as Caesar, a fact that struck him with unexpected force. Here he was, handling provincial paperwork, while men no more talented than himself were winning the kind of glory that echoed through the ages. Alexander the Great, he reflected, had conquered half the known world by the age Caesar had now reached. The thought filled him not with despair, but with a fierce determination to make his mark before time ran out. That night, unable to sleep, Caesar walked out onto the villa's small terrace and looked up at the stars that wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns. The same constellations had looked down on Romulus when he founded the city, on Scipio when he defeated Hannibal, on Pompey during his eastern conquests. They would continue their dance long after every living Roman had turned to dust, but some names would be remembered as long as men told stories of greatness achieved and empires built. And so the story flows on, as ambition kindled in a young man's heart, like flame catching in dry tinder, bright and warm and utterly transformative. Caesar's year in Spain proved profitable in more ways than one. His administrative competence ensured that the province's taxes flowed smoothly to Rome, earning him praise from his superiors and valuable experience in the practical management of empire. More importantly, he had opportunities to lead small military expeditions against bandits and unconquered tribes, giving him his first real taste of independent command. These were not glorious campaigns that would be celebrated in epic poems, but rather the grinding, unglamorous work that actually held the empire together. Caesar learned to march his men across scorching plains where the summer heat rose in shimmering waves, to find water in country that seemed utterly barren, to choose ground for camps that could be defended against night attacks by desperate enemies who knew every rock and gully. He discovered that he had a natural talent for the soldier's life. Unlike many aristocratic Romans who saw military service as an unpleasant necessity, Caesar genuinely enjoyed the camaraderie of the camp, the clarity of purpose that came with simple objectives, and the immediate feedback that distinguished successful tactics from failed ones. His men began to trust him because he shared their hardships, eating the same rations and sleeping under the same stars. More significantly, Caesar began to develop the personal style that would eventually make him the most beloved general in Roman history. He made it his business to learn every soldier's name, to inquire about their families, and remember personal details from conversation to conversation. When men were wounded, he would visit them personally, and when they died, he would see that their families received not just the standard death benefits, but often additional assistance from his own funds. This approach to leadership was unusual among Roman commanders, who typically maintained strict social distance from their troops. Caesar's critics would later claim that he was dangerously populist, that his easy familiarity with common soldiers undermined proper military discipline. But Caesar understood something that escaped his more conventional colleagues. In an age when civil wars were becoming increasingly common, the loyalty of the legions might prove more valuable than the approval of the Senate. His return to Rome was marked by a personal tragedy that would shadow the rest of his life. Cornelia, his beloved wife, died during his absence, succumbing to one of the fevers that regularly swept through the crowded neighborhoods of the ancient city. The news reached him just as he was preparing to embark for Italy, turning what should have been a triumphant homecoming into a journey of mourning. The funeral was a deeply moving affair that revealed the genuine affection Caesar had felt for his young wife. Against all precedent, he delivered a public eulogy for Cornelia, praising not only her virtue and beauty, but also her intelligence and strength of character. Roman women were typically honored in death with brief, formulaic tributes, but Caesar spoke from the heart about a partnership that had been cut tragically short. His visible grief won him sympathy throughout the city and demonstrated a capacity for deep emotion that many had not suspected. In time, the path led him onward to new alliances and fresh opportunities, as the widowed young politician began to navigate the treacherous currents of Roman ambition with increasing skill and confidence. The Rome that welcomed Caesar back from Spain was a city in transition, where old certainties were being challenged by new realities at every turn. The traditional mechanisms of republican government, designed for a city-state governing a modest territory in central Italy, were straining under the weight of administering an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Ambitious men were beginning to realize that conventional political careers might no longer be sufficient to achieve their goals. Caesar's next step up the traditional ladder of advancement was election to the aedileship, a position that might seem modest to modern observers, but carried enormous potential for an ambitious politician. The aediles were responsible for organizing public games and festivals, maintaining public buildings, and overseeing the markets that fed Rome's growing population. Most importantly, they had opportunities to spend vast sums on entertainments that would win the gratitude of the common people. Caesar approached his aedile duties with characteristic energy and imagination. He understood that in a city where only a tiny fraction of citizens could participate directly in political debates, public spectacles were the primary means by which politicians communicated with the masses. The games he organized were so spectacular that they became the talk of Rome, featuring gladiatorial contests of unprecedented scale and variety, wild beast hunts that brought exotic animals from Africa and Asia, and theatrical performances that combined entertainment with subtle political messaging. The costs were enormous, far exceeding what Caesar could afford from his own resources. He borrowed heavily from moneylenders, mortgaged his family property, and entered into financial arrangements that would have bankrupted a less ambitious man. His critics whispered that he was courting ruin for the sake of temporary popularity, but Caesar was playing a longer game. He understood that debt could be a tool as well as a burden, binding creditors to his success while demonstrating confidence in his future prospects. One of his most popular innovations was the restoration of statues and monuments honoring Gaius Marius, the great general who had been Sulla's enemy and whose memory had been officially condemned during the years of Optimate's control. Caesar's workers replaced these monuments quietly in the pre-dawn hours when the Forum was nearly empty. But by morning, all of Rome was buzzing with the news. Veterans who had served under Marius wept openly at seeing their old commander's image restored to honor, while younger citizens were reminded that there had been heroes before Pompey and alternatives to aristocratic rule. The gesture was carefully calculated political theater that demonstrated Caesar's growing sophistication as a populist politician. He had honored the memory of a great Roman without directly challenging current authority, appealed to military veterans without appearing to threaten civilian control, and positioned himself as a champion of the people without resorting to crude demagoguery. The Optimates were furious, but could find no legal grounds for prosecution, while the populares began to see Caesar as a potential leader for their faction. And so the story flows on as the young politician learned to make every gesture count and every expenditure serve multiple purposes in the complex game of Roman power. Caesar's success as aedile led inevitably to his election as praetor, the next level of the Roman political hierarchy. This was a position of real authority, involving judicial responsibilities and the potential for military command that could lead to lasting fame. But Caesar's path to the praetorship was complicated by one of the most significant religious controversies in Roman history, a scandal that nearly destroyed his career before it truly began. The scandal centered on the festival of Bona Dea, the good goddess, one of Rome's most ancient and mysterious religious observances. This was a women-only ceremony held annually in the home of a senior magistrate, where matrons and their daughters would gather to perform secret rituals that were said to ensure the fertility of the land and the protection of the state. Men were strictly forbidden from any involvement in the proceedings, and even male servants and slaves were banished from the house for the duration of the ceremony. In the year of Caesar's praetorship, the festival was held in his own home, presided over by his wife Pompeia, whom he had married after Cornelia's death. The night proceeded normally until one of the female attendants discovered a man hiding among the women, disguised in women's clothing and apparently attempting to spy on the sacred mysteries. The intruder was identified as Publius Clodius Pulcher, a young aristocrat with a reputation for scandal and a talent for creating chaos wherever he went. The religious implications of Clodius's sacrilege were enormous. Roman state religion was not a matter of personal belief, but of collective ritual obligations that maintained the favor of the gods. If the ceremonies were polluted by male presence, the consequences might include plague, famine, military defeat, or any number of divine punishments that would affect all citizens. The College of Pontiffs, Rome's senior religious authorities, declared that the entire festival would have to be repeated with elaborate purification rituals. The political implications were equally serious. Clodius claimed that he had been nowhere near Caesar's house on the night in question, but his alibi was transparently false and his motives were obviously scandalous. Some whispered that he had been conducting an affair with Pompeia, while others suggested that his real goal was to embarrass Caesar by creating a religious scandal that would destroy his political prospects. Caesar's response to the crisis was characteristically decisive. He immediately divorced Pompeia, declaring in words that would become famous, "Caesar's wife must be above suspicion." He made it clear that he had no personal knowledge of any wrongdoing by his wife, but that the mere association with scandal was incompatible with his public position. The gesture was both politically astute and personally painful, sacrificing a marriage that had brought him happiness for the sake of his career. The trial of Clodius became one of the most celebrated legal proceedings of the age. The prosecution was led by some of Rome's finest orators, who painted the defendant as a dangerous enemy of religion and public order. The defense, equally skilled, attempted to portray the whole affair as a youthful prank that had been blown out of proportion by political enemies. Caesar himself was called as a witness, and his testimony was eagerly anticipated by the crowds that packed the forum. In time, the path led him onward to a decision that would demonstrate both his political wisdom and his ability to see beyond immediate advantage to longer-term strategy. When Caesar took the witness stand, all of Rome held its breath. Here was the moment when he could destroy Clodius with a few words, eliminating a potential rival and demonstrating his commitment to religious propriety. The prosecution had prepared their questions carefully, confident that Caesar would support their case with decisive testimony about what had occurred in his own home. Instead, Caesar delivered one of the most surprising testimonies in Roman legal history. He stated simply that he had no direct knowledge of Clodius's presence at the ceremony, had not personally observed any sacrilege, and could not swear to facts he had not witnessed himself. It was technically truthful, but utterly unhelpful to the prosecution, and it effectively sabotaged their case. Clodius was acquitted by the narrowest of margins, and Caesar found himself with an unexpected ally who would prove valuable in future political battles. The testimony revealed Caesar's growing maturity as a politician. He had recognized that Clodius, despite his obvious flaws, possessed talents that might be useful to the popularis faction. The young aristocrat was a gifted demagogue who could sway crowds with fiery oratory, and his family connections gave him influence among groups that might otherwise be unreachable. By helping to secure his acquittal, Caesar was investing in future cooperation rather than pursuing immediate revenge. Caesar's praetorship proved to be an excellent training ground for the challenges that lay ahead. His judicial duties required him to balance competing interests and find practical solutions to complex legal problems. He showed particular skill in commercial disputes, demonstrating an understanding of economic issues that would serve him well in his later administrative roles. More importantly, he used his position to build networks of obligation and gratitude that extended throughout Roman society. His Praetorian province was further Spain, the same region where he had served as quaestor, but now with full executive authority. The appointment came with military responsibilities that finally gave Caesar the opportunity to win the kind of glory that could transform a political career overnight. The tribes of northwestern Iberia had been raiding Roman settlements, and the provincial governor before Caesar had failed to restore order despite several expensive campaigns. Caesar approached his Spanish command with meticulous preparation. He studied the reports of his predecessors, identifying their tactical mistakes and strategic oversights. He interviewed veterans who had served in the region, learning about local terrain, weather patterns, and tribal customs. Most importantly, he began recruiting a personal staff of talented young men who could serve as his eyes and ears throughout the campaign. The army he assembled was small by the standards of major Roman campaigns, consisting of perhaps 10,000 legionaries supported by auxiliary troops and cavalry. But Caesar had handpicked many of his officers, choosing men who shared his vision of aggressive, mobile warfare. He also made sure that his soldiers were equipped with the finest weapons and armor that money could buy, reasoning that superior equipment could multiply the effectiveness of well-trained troops. And so, the story flows on, as Caesar prepared to test himself in the ultimate proving ground of Roman ambition, where military success could elevate a man to heights that political skill alone could never reach. The campaigns that followed in Spain were Caesar's first independent military commands, and they revealed capabilities that would eventually reshape the ancient world. Unlike his predecessors, who had attempted to defeat the Iberian tribes through massive frontal assaults, Caesar employed a strategy of rapid movement and concentrated strikes that kept his enemies off balance and unable to coordinate their resistance. His first objective was a tribal confederation that controlled the mountainous regions overlooking the Roman coastal settlements. Previous governors had attempted to besiege their hilltop fortresses, usually abandoning the effort when autumn weather made supply lines impossible to maintain. Caesar chose instead to attack during winter, when the tribes assumed they were safe from Roman interference. The march through snow-covered mountain passes became legendary among his troops. Caesar shared every hardship, walking alongside his men when the terrain became too difficult for horses, helping to carry supplies when pack animals faltered, and maintaining morale through personal example rather than harsh discipline. When advance scouts reported that a crucial pass was blocked by an avalanche, Caesar personally led the engineering work to clear the path, wielding a shovel alongside common soldiers until the route was passable once more. The surprise winter assault achieved complete success. The tribal warriors, caught unprepared for warfare in the depths of winter, found themselves facing disciplined Roman legions that moved with precision even in the harshest conditions. Caesar's victory was not merely tactical, but psychological, demonstrating that Roman arms could reach anywhere, in any season, whenever duty demanded. The defeated chieftains were treated with honor. Their followers were given opportunities to serve as Roman auxiliaries, and the conquered territories were organized with the efficient administration that marked all of Caesar's later achievements. More victories followed in rapid succession as Caesar's reputation spread throughout the peninsula. Tribes that might have resisted for years chose instead to negotiate, recognizing that accommodation with Rome offered more advantages than futile resistance. Caesar's approach to these negotiations revealed the diplomatic skills that would later serve him so well in Gaul and beyond. He understood that lasting conquest required not just military defeat, but the transformation of enemies into allies, of conquered peoples into willing participants in the Roman system. The wealth that flowed from these campaigns finally freed Caesar from the crushing debts he had accumulated during his political career. Spanish gold and silver filled the military treasury, providing funds for bonuses that made his soldiers devoted to his cause, while also allowing him to repay his creditors in Rome with interest. More importantly, the campaigns had given him the military credibility that was essential for advancement to the highest levels of Roman politics. His return to Rome was carefully orchestrated to maximize political impact. Instead of requesting a formal triumph, which would have required him to remain outside the city until the ceremony could be arranged, Caesar chose to enter Rome quietly, and immediately declare his candidacy for the consulship. This decision revealed his growing political sophistication, his understanding that immediate action was often more valuable than elaborate ceremonial recognition. The consular campaign that followed was one of the most expensive and competitive in Roman history. Caesar faced formidable opponents, including Marcus Bibulus, a respected conservative who had the backing of the Optimates and unlimited financial resources. The contest became a proxy war between the Populares and Optimates factions, with enormous sums spent on bribery, entertainment, and propaganda that reached every corner of the city. In time, the path led him onward to the prize that had been his goal since youth, the consulship that would place him among the most powerful men in the world. Caesar's election to the consulship marked a turning point, not just in his own career, but in the history of the Roman Republic. The campaign had been so bitter and expensive that it left lasting wounds in the body politic, while the methods used by both sides pushed the boundaries of acceptable political behavior ever further toward outright warfare. Caesar's victory was narrow but decisive, and it brought him to the pinnacle of constitutional authority at the perfect moment to implement the grand strategy that had been taking shape in his mind for years. His colleague in the consulship was Marcus Bibulus, his former rival, who had been chosen by the Optimates as their champion. Roman tradition expected the two consuls to work together, sharing power and responsibility in the collegiate manner that was supposed to prevent any individual from gaining too much authority. But Caesar had no intention of sharing power with a man who represented everything he opposed, and Bibulus proved equally unwilling to compromise with someone he regarded as a dangerous radical. The conflict between the consuls began almost immediately over Caesar's proposed land law, a comprehensive measure designed to provide farms for veterans and urban poor, while also addressing the economic problems that were destabilizing Roman society. The proposal was not particularly radical by the standards of earlier populares legislation, but it threatened the interests of wealthy landowners who had profited from the current system of concentrated ownership. When Bibulus attempted to block the legislation through traditional constitutional means, Caesar responded with tactics that shocked even his supporters. He bypassed the Senate entirely and took his proposal directly to the popular assemblies, using techniques of mass persuasion that transformed political debate into something approaching street theater. The crowds that gathered in the forum to hear Caesar speak were unlike anything Rome had seen before, drawn not just from the traditional citizen base, but from the urban masses who had previously been excluded from meaningful political participation. Caesar's oratory during this period reached heights that established him as one of the greatest speakers in Roman history. His speeches combined logical argument with emotional appeal, sophisticated political theory with practical promises of immediate benefit. He spoke directly to the concerns of ordinary Romans, veterans who needed land, urban workers who struggled to feed their families, small farmers who were being driven off their holdings by slave-worked estates. His words carried conviction because they addressed real problems with concrete solutions. The confrontation reached its climax when Bibulus attempted to physically prevent the passage of Caesar's law by appearing in the forum with a band of supporters. The resulting riot was brief but decisive. Bibulus was roughly handled by Caesar's partisans, his fasces were broken, and a basket of dung was poured over his head in a humiliation that symbolized the collapse of traditional senatorial authority. From that day forward, Bibulus remained in his house, issuing ineffective proclamations that declared all of Caesar's acts invalid, while Caesar governed Rome as if he were sole consul. And so the story flows on, as the Roman Republic took another step toward the precipice that would eventually destroy it, guided by a man who believed that bold action was preferable to noble inaction. The transformation of Caesar's consulship into a virtual monarchy shocked Roman traditionalists, but delighted the common people who were finally seeing their interests represented by someone with the power to act. Caesar's land law was passed and immediately began redistributing public lands to veterans and poor citizens. His other legislative initiatives addressed debt relief, provincial administration, and the expansion of citizenship rights in ways that demonstrated both his understanding of Rome's problems and his determination to solve them, regardless of constitutional niceties. Perhaps most importantly, Caesar used his consular authority to forge an alliance that would dominate Roman politics for the next decade. The partnership that emerged, known to historians as the First Triumvirate, brought together three of the most powerful men in Rome: Caesar himself, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Latinius Crassus. Each brought different strengths to the alliance. Caesar provided political skill and popular support. Pompey contributed military prestige and veteran loyalty, while Crassus offered the vast wealth that made ambitious projects possible. The alliance was sealed by a marriage between Caesar's daughter Julia and Pompey, a union that surprised Rome with its genuine affection despite its obviously political origins. Julia was barely 20, intelligent and beautiful, while Pompey was nearly twice her age and had been married several times before. Yet the couple seemed genuinely devoted to each other, and their happiness provided a human dimension to what might otherwise have been seen as a purely cynical arrangement. With his consulship nearing its end, Caesar faced the prospect that his enemies would attempt to prosecute him for the constitutional violations he had committed during his year in office. Roman law provided some protection through the concept of provocatio, which allowed citizens to appeal death sentences to the popular assemblies. But Caesar's innovations had been so extensive that traditional legal protections might prove inadequate. The solution lay in securing a proconsular command that would provide him with imperium, the legal authority that would make him immune from prosecution, while giving him the opportunity to win the military glory that could make him unassailable. The provinces available were not particularly attractive, peaceful territories that offered little opportunity for conquest or profit. But Caesar's allies in the Senate, working with tribunes who could threaten vetoes, managed to arrange something unprecedented: a 5-year command in Gaul that would give him authority over both the civilized province of Gallia Narbonensis and the unconquered territories beyond the Alps. The appointment seemed almost too good to be true, and indeed many senators voted for it, because they believed it would either destroy Caesar or at least remove him from Roman politics for years to come. Gaul was known to be populous and warlike, filled with tribes that had resisted Roman expansion for generations. Previous governors had been content to maintain the existing boundaries and collect taxes from peaceful regions, understanding that major campaigns would be both expensive and dangerous. In time, the path led him onward to the greatest adventure of his life: a series of campaigns that would add immense territories to the Roman Empire while making Caesar's name immortal. The Gaul that Caesar encountered when he took up his command was a land of extraordinary diversity and complexity, far removed from the simple barbarian stereotype that many Romans held. The region encompassed territories that stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the English Channel, from the Rhine River to the Atlantic Ocean, inhabited by dozens of tribes that spoke related languages but maintained distinct cultures and often conflicting interests. Some Gallic tribes, particularly those in the south, had been in contact with Roman civilization for generations. Their nobles wore Roman-style clothing. Their children learned Latin alongside their native tongues, and their warriors sometimes served as auxiliaries in Roman armies. These tribes had adopted Roman agricultural techniques, urban planning, and commercial practices while maintaining their own religious traditions and social structures. Further north, however, lay territories that remained largely untouched by Mediterranean influence. Here, Celtic warriors still fought with weapons their ancestors had carried. Druids performed ancient sacrifices in sacred groves, and tribal assemblies made decisions according to customs that predated the founding of Rome. These peoples were not primitive. They possessed sophisticated metalworking skills, elaborate legal systems, and oral traditions that preserved historical knowledge with remarkable accuracy. But they were also fiercely independent and deeply suspicious of foreign interference. Caesar's first major challenge came from an unexpected source: the Helvetii, a tribe from what is now Switzerland, who had decided to migrate en masse to new territories in Western Gaul. The movement involved hundreds of thousands of people, warriors and their families, herds of cattle, and all the possessions that a nomadic people could carry. Such a migration would necessarily involve crossing Roman territory, and the disruption it would cause to established tribal boundaries might trigger conflicts that could spread throughout the region. The Helvetii sent ambassadors to Caesar, requesting permission to pass through the Roman province, promising to cause no damage and to compensate for any supplies they might need to purchase. Their request was not unreasonable by the standards of tribal diplomacy, and many Roman governors would have granted permission in exchange for appropriate guarantees and tribute. But Caesar saw in the Helvetian migration an opportunity that was too valuable to miss. He refused permission for the crossing, citing concerns about the security of Roman territory and the welfare of allied tribes. When the Helvetii attempted to find alternative routes, Caesar declared that their movements constituted a threat to Roman interests and began mobilizing his legions for what would become the first of his great Gallic campaigns. The war that followed was brief but decisive, demonstrating both Caesar's military genius and his ability to transform potential problems into advantageous opportunities. The Helvetii, burdened by their families and possessions, could not match the mobility of Caesar's legions. At the Battle of Bebracht, Caesar achieved a complete victory that not only ended the migration, but also established his reputation as a general capable of achieving the impossible. And so the story flows on, as Caesar began the conquest that would reshape the map of Europe and transform him from a successful politician into one of history's greatest military commanders. The victory over the Helvetii was only the beginning of Caesar's Gallic adventure. Word of his success spread rapidly throughout the region, bringing him requests for assistance from tribal leaders who saw Roman military might as a solution to their own local problems. One such request came from the Sequani and other tribes who were being threatened by Ariovistus, a German king who had crossed the Rhine with a large army and was attempting to establish a permanent kingdom in Gallic territory. Caesar's decision to intervene against Ariovistus was controversial even among his own officers. The German king had been recognized as a friend and ally by the Roman Senate, and his activities in Gaul could be seen as internal barbarian affairs that did not directly concern Roman interests. Some of Caesar's lieutenants argued that he was exceeding his authority and risking unnecessary complications with peoples who had not threatened Roman territory. But Caesar understood that the precedent established by his response to Ariovistus would determine the future of Roman policy in Gaul. If he allowed a German warlord to establish an independent kingdom beyond the Roman frontier, other ambitious leaders would be encouraged to similar ventures. The balance of power that had kept the frontier relatively stable would be upset, potentially creating threats that would require much larger and more expensive military responses in the future. The campaign against Ariovistus became a masterpiece of psychological warfare as well as military strategy. Caesar recognized that his enemy's greatest advantage lay in the fearsome reputation of German warriors, who were widely regarded as larger, stronger, and more ferocious than their Gallic or Roman counterparts. Many of Caesar's own soldiers had never faced Germanic opponents and were nervous about the coming battle. Caesar addressed these concerns through a combination of practical preparation and inspirational leadership. He made sure his troops were well equipped and thoroughly trained, but he also took every opportunity to remind them of their superior discipline, organization, and tactical flexibility. When rumors spread through the camp that the Germans were invincible in battle, Caesar called his officers together and delivered one of the great speeches of his military career. He reminded his men that they were inheritors of a military tradition stretching back to the legendary founders of Rome, that they carried the eagles that had conquered the civilized world, and that no barbarian army had ever been able to stand against disciplined Roman legions fighting on ground of their own choosing. His confidence was so absolute and his arguments so persuasive that the mood in the camp transformed overnight from nervous apprehension to eager anticipation. The battle itself was almost anticlimactic. When the two armies finally met, the Germans discovered that Roman organization and equipment more than compensated for any individual advantages they might have possessed. Ariovistus's forces were routed so completely that the king himself barely escaped across the Rhine with a handful of followers, leaving behind a vast plunder of weapons, supplies, and prisoners that enriched Caesar's veterans and demonstrated Roman superiority to every tribe in Gaul. In time, the path led him onward to challenges that would test not just his military skills, but his ability to understand and manipulate the complex political relationships that bound together the Celtic world. The defeat of Ariovistus established Caesar as the dominant military force in Gaul, but it also created new problems that would require all his diplomatic skills to resolve. The German king's rapid collapse had upset the balance of power throughout the region, creating opportunities for ambitious tribal leaders while also generating fears about Roman intentions. Some Gallic nobles saw Caesar as a potential ally who could help them achieve their own goals, while others viewed him as a threat to traditional independence that needed to be resisted before it became overwhelming. Caesar spent the winter months following his victory, establishing a network of alliances and obligations that would serve as the foundation for Roman rule in Gaul. He understood that lasting conquest required more than military success. It demanded the creation of new political structures that could replace the traditional tribal system, while preserving enough familiar elements to maintain popular acceptance. His approach to Gallic politics revealed the same sophisticated understanding of human motivation that had served him so well in Rome. He identified the natural leaders in each community, the men whose authority derived from personal qualities rather than traditional position, and he worked to bind them to Roman interests through a combination of threats and rewards. Some received Roman citizenship, others were given command positions in auxiliary units, and still others were allowed to maintain their traditional authority as long as they cooperated with Roman policy. The strategy proved remarkably effective, but it also created resentments that would eventually explode into the greatest crisis of Caesar's career. Traditional Gallic leaders, who had been bypassed in favor of Roman collaborators, began to organize resistance movements that drew support from those who felt that their ancient customs and freedoms were being sacrificed to foreign domination. The first major test of Caesar's Gallic settlement came from an unexpected source: the Belgae, a confederation of tribes from the northeastern regions who had remained neutral during the earlier campaigns, but now felt threatened by the expansion of Roman influence. The Belgae were renowned throughout Gaul for their fierce independence and military prowess, and their decision to unite against Rome represented a challenge of an entirely different magnitude from anything Caesar had previously faced. The Belgic Confederation could field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, drawn from tribes that had never known defeat, and led by warriors who had inherited centuries of military tradition. Their alliance included not only the major tribal groups, but also Germanic settlers who had crossed the Rhine in earlier generations, and smaller communities that saw Roman expansion as an existential threat to their way of life. Caesar's response to the Belgic threat demonstrated his growing mastery of large-scale military operations. Instead of waiting for the enemy to complete their preparations, he struck first, dividing his forces to attack multiple tribal centers simultaneously, while using his diplomatic contacts to prevent the Confederation from achieving complete unity. The campaigns that followed were among the most challenging of his career, requiring him to adapt his tactics to face enemies who knew their own terrain intimately and fought with desperate courage. And so the story flows on, as Caesar learned that true conquest required not just victory in battle, but the patient work of building new societies from the ruins of the old. The Belgic Wars tested Caesar's legions in ways that previous campaigns had not, forcing Roman soldiers to fight in dense forests where their traditional tactical advantages were minimized, and to assault fortified positions that seemed impossible to capture. The Belgae had learned from the defeats of other Gallic tribes, adopting defensive strategies that maximized their natural advantages while minimizing Roman superiority in open field battles. One of the most memorable engagements of the campaign was the siege of the Aduatuci, a tribe that had taken refuge in a massive hilltop fortress that commanded the surrounding countryside. The fortress was considered impregnable by local standards, protected by steep cliffs on three sides, and accessible only through a narrow approach that could be easily defended by a handful of warriors. previous Roman commanders might have attempted to starve out the defenders or negotiated some face-saving compromise that would have allowed both sides to claim victory. Caesar chose instead to demonstrate Roman engineering capabilities in a display that became legendary throughout Gaul. His legions constructed siege works of unprecedented complexity, including towers that rose higher than the fortress walls and artillery engines that could hurl stones with devastating accuracy. The Aduatuci, who had never seen such machines, initially laughed at what they assumed were Roman toys. Their laughter turned to terror when the siege engines began their bombardment, shattering stone walls that had stood for generations and making it clear that no defensive position could withstand Roman determination. The psychological impact of the siege was as important as its military results. Word spread throughout Gaul that Caesar possessed weapons that could breach any fortification, knowledge that would make future sieges shorter and less costly as defenders chose surrender over hopeless resistance. More importantly, the siege demonstrated Caesar's willingness to invest enormous resources in achieving complete victory, a lesson that was not lost on tribal leaders who might have been considering resistance. The defeat of the Belgae effectively completed Caesar's conquest of central and northern Gaul, but it also revealed the magnitude of the task he had undertaken. The territories now under Roman control encompassed an area larger than Italy itself, inhabited by perhaps 10 million people who spoke dozens of different languages and followed countless local customs. Transforming this vast region into a stable Roman province would require administrative skills of the highest order and military forces capable of maintaining order across impossible distances. Caesar's solution was to create a system of indirect rule that preserved the appearance of traditional authority while ensuring Roman control over all important decisions. Tribal leaders who demonstrated loyalty to Rome were allowed to maintain their positions and exercise considerable autonomy in local affairs, but they understood that their authority ultimately derived from Roman approval and could be withdrawn at any time. The system worked well as long as Roman military superiority remained unquestioned, but it also created inherent instabilities that would eventually threaten everything Caesar had achieved. The collaborative leaders who governed in Rome's name were often seen by their own people as traitors who had sold their birthright for foreign rewards, while traditional authorities who had been displaced plotted constantly to regain their former positions. In time, the path led him onward to the most dangerous phase of his Gallic adventure, when suppressed resentments would explode into a rebellion that would test his skills as never before. The years following the Belgic conquest were marked by a series of smaller campaigns that gradually extended Roman authority to the farthest corners of Gaul. Caesar's legions crossed the Rhine to punish German tribes that had been supporting Gallic resistance, ventured into the mysterious forests of the Ardennes to subdue rebellious communities, and even launched expeditions across the narrow waters that separated Gaul from the island of Britain. The British expeditions, though limited in scope, captured the imagination of Romans who had grown up hearing stories about the mysterious island at the edge of the world. Britain was rumored to be rich in tin and other metals, inhabited by fierce warriors who painted themselves blue and worshipped strange gods in sacred groves. Some claimed that the island was shrouded in perpetual mist, while others insisted that it was populated by giants or creatures that were part human and part beast. Caesar's first crossing of the Channel was more an armed reconnaissance than a full-scale invasion, but it served its purpose of demonstrating that Roman arms could reach anywhere, no matter how remote or supposedly impregnable. The sight of Roman eagles planted on British beaches sent a message throughout the Celtic world that no natural barrier could protect those who opposed Rome's expansion. The expedition also provided Caesar with valuable intelligence about British society and military capabilities. He discovered that the island was not the primitive wasteland that some had imagined, but rather a complex civilization with sophisticated metalworking, elaborate fortifications, and political structures that rivaled those of Gaul. The British tribes maintained extensive trade networks, fielded disciplined armies, and possessed naval capabilities that had allowed them to intervene in Gallic affairs for generations. Caesar's second British expedition was larger and more ambitious, involving 2 full legions and auxiliary forces that brought the invasion army to perhaps 25,000 men. The landing was opposed by British forces that had learned from the previous year's experience, but Roman discipline and superior equipment eventually prevailed. Caesar's forces penetrated deep into the British interior, winning several battles and extracting tribute from defeated tribes before returning to Gaul with hostages and plunder that demonstrated the success of the campaign. The British expeditions enhanced Caesar's reputation throughout the Roman world, providing him with the kind of exotic achievements that distinguished truly great commanders from merely successful ones. But they also extended his commitments at a time when his position in Gaul was becoming increasingly precarious, and they diverted resources that might have been better used to consolidate his existing conquests. And so the story flows on, as Caesar's very successors began to create the conditions that would lead to his greatest crisis, teaching him that in the game of empire, every victory creates new challenges that must be overcome. The crisis that would test everything Caesar had achieved in Gaul began to develop in the winter of 54 to 53 BCE, when a series of seemingly unrelated incidents combined to create a perfect storm of rebellion. The immediate cause was a grain shortage that forced Caesar to disperse his legions among several winter camps rather than concentrating them in secure positions. This dispersal, though militarily necessary, created opportunities for enemies who had been waiting for signs of Roman weakness. The first blow fell on the camp of Sabinus and Cotta, 2 of Caesar's most experienced lieutenants who were wintering with a legion and a half in the territory of the Eburones. The local chieftain, Ambiorix, convinced the Romans that they were in immediate danger from a German invasion, and offered to provide safe passage to another Roman camp if they would abandon their current position. Against their better judgment, the Roman commanders agreed to march, and their column was ambushed in a forested valley where their tactical advantages were nullified. The destruction of Sabinus and Cotta's force was the worst military disaster Caesar had experienced in Gaul, and news of the defeat spread rapidly throughout the region. Suddenly, tribes that had seemed securely pacified began to reconsider their allegiance to Rome, while traditional leaders who had been waiting for an opportunity to regain power emerged from hiding to organize resistance movements. The most dangerous development was the emergence of a coordinated rebellion that united tribes across vast distances in a common effort to expel Roman forces from Gaul. This was not the spontaneous uprising of a single community, but rather a carefully planned campaign that demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking and impressive organizational capabilities. The rebels had learned from their earlier defeats, adopting tactics that neutralized Roman advantages while maximizing their own strengths. Caesar's response to the crisis revealed his abilities as a military commander at their highest level. Despite being outnumbered by odds that might have discouraged a lesser general, he refused to consider retreat or compromise. Instead, he immediately began a series of rapid marches that brought relief to his scattered forces while demonstrating to friend and foe alike that Roman power remained unbroken. The winter campaign that followed was one of the most remarkable achievements in military history. With snow covering the ground and supply lines constantly threatened by enemy action, Caesar's legions moved with clockwork precision from one threatened position to another. His personal leadership during this period became legendary among his troops, who saw their commander sharing every hardship and danger while maintaining the confidence and good humor that had made him beloved. The decisive moment came when Caesar learned that Quintus Cicero, brother of the famous orator and one of his most trusted subordinates, was besieged in his winter camp by overwhelming enemy forces. The situation was desperate, with Cicero's garrison reduced to a handful of effective soldiers, and their position becoming more precarious with each passing day. In time, the path led him onward to a rescue mission that would demonstrate his tactical brilliance while also revealing the loyalty his leadership had inspired among men who would follow him anywhere. The march to relieve Cicero's beleaguered garrison became one of the most celebrated episodes in Caesar's military career, a perfect example of how superior leadership and tactical flexibility could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Caesar's relief force was small, consisting of only 2 legions and some auxiliary troops, but it moved with the speed and precision that had become the hallmark of his operations. The enemy forces besieging Cicero numbered in the tens of thousands, drawn from multiple tribes that had coordinated their efforts with impressive efficiency. They had constructed elaborate siege works around the Roman camp, including trenches, palisades, and artillery positions that demonstrated their growing sophistication in siege warfare. More ominously, they had learned to maintain discipline under pressure, avoiding the impulsive charges that had characterized earlier Gallic tactics. Caesar's approach to the rescue mission demonstrated his mastery of psychological warfare as well as conventional military strategy. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the siege lines, which would have been suicidal given the odds, he used a combination of deception and mobility to confuse his enemies and create opportunities for decisive action. His first step was to establish communications with the besieged garrison through a series of coded messages that revealed the scope of his relief efforts while providing specific instructions for coordinated action. The messages were carried by Gallic allies who could move freely through enemy territory, and they served to maintain morale among Cicero's troops, while also gathering intelligence about enemy dispositions and intentions. When Caesar finally struck, his attack came from an unexpected direction, and at a time when the enemy was distracted by what appeared to be a Roman retreat. The assault was coordinated with a sortie from the besieged camp, creating confusion in the enemy ranks that Caesar's veterans exploited with devastating effectiveness. The siege was broken within hours, and the rebel forces scattered in defeat, leaving behind vast quantities of equipment and supplies that would sustain Caesar's forces through the remainder of the winter. The relief of Cicero's camp marked the turning point in the Great Gallic Rebellion, but it also revealed the extent to which Caesar's position in Gaul depended on his personal presence and leadership. His enemies had learned that Roman forces could be defeated when they were not directly commanded by Caesar himself, a lesson that would influence their strategy in the final phase of the conflict. The following spring brought new challenges as the rebellion spread to regions that had previously been considered completely pacified. The movement was no longer simply a matter of traditional tribal resistance to foreign rule, but had evolved into something approaching a national liberation struggle that drew support from all levels of Gallic society. Druids, who had previously remained neutral, began to preach that the gods demanded the expulsion of Roman influence, while merchants and craftsmen who had profited from Roman trade now contributed to the war effort. And so the story flows on, as Caesar faced the greatest test of his career, a conflict that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of Gaul and the balance of power in the Roman world. The final phase of the Gallic Wars was dominated by the emergence of a leader who would prove to be Caesar's most formidable opponent, a young Arverni chieftain named Vercingetorix, whose name would become synonymous with Celtic resistance to Roman rule. Unlike previous Gallic leaders, who had relied primarily on traditional warfare and local loyalties, Vercingetorix understood that defeating Caesar would require new strategies and unprecedented unity among the traditionally fractious Celtic tribes. Vercingetorix was in many ways Caesar's opposite, a product of traditional Celtic society who embodied the warrior values that had shaped his people for centuries. He was young, probably in his early 30s, and came from a family that had long held prominence among the Arverni. His father had been executed for seeking to restore the monarchy among his people, a background that gave Vercingetorix both personal motivation for opposing Roman rule and valuable experience in the complexities of tribal politics. But Vercingetorix was more than simply a traditional Celtic warrior. He had observed Roman methods closely, studying their strengths and weaknesses with the attention of a natural strategist. He understood that previous Gallic rebellions had failed because they had attempted to fight Caesar on his own terms, meeting disciplined legions in pitched battles where Roman training and equipment provided decisive advantages. His strategy for the new rebellion was radically different from anything Caesar had faced before. Instead of seeking quick victory through dramatic battles, Vercingetorix adopted a scorched earth policy designed to deny Caesar's forces the supplies they needed to maintain their positions. Gallic villages were evacuated and their food stores destroyed. Cattle were driven into hiding, and crops were burned in the fields to prevent Roman foraging. The psychological impact of this strategy was as important as its practical effects. For the first time in the Gallic Wars, Caesar found himself consistently frustrated by an enemy who refused to offer battle on Roman terms. His legions, accustomed to decisive victories that ended campaigns quickly, instead found themselves engaged in a grinding war of attrition where progress was measured in miles rather than dramatic battlefield triumphs. Vercingetorix also demonstrated unprecedented skill in uniting the fractious Celtic tribes under a single command. This was perhaps his greatest achievement, for Celtic society had traditionally been characterized by constant warfare between competing groups. The chieftain's ability to forge a genuine coalition from these disparate elements revealed political talents that matched his military abilities. The rebellion reached its climax with the siege of Alesia, a hilltop fortress that Vercingetorix chose as his final stronghold after a series of strategic retreats had drawn Caesar's forces deep into hostile territory. The position seemed impregnable, protected by steep cliffs and commanding views that would make any assault suicidal. More importantly, Vercingetorix had gathered a massive relief army that was marching to break any siege Caesar might attempt. In time, the path led him onward to the confrontation that would determine the fate of Gaul and establish his reputation as one of history's greatest military commanders. The siege of Alesia became the defining moment of Caesar's career, a military operation so complex and audacious that it seemed impossible even to many of his own officers. Faced with an enemy force that outnumbered his own troops by perhaps 10-1, Caesar devised a strategy that would have been rejected as fantasy by any rational commander. He would simultaneously besiege Vercingetorix's forces within Alesia, while also defending against the massive relief army that was approaching from the outside. The engineering project that Caesar's legions undertook was staggering in its scope and ambition. Working with the methodical efficiency that characterized all Roman military operations, they constructed 2 complete lines of fortifications around Alesia, one facing inward to contain the defenders, and another facing outward to protect against the relief force. The inner line, known as the circumvallation, stretched for 10 miles around the hilltop fortress, while the outer line, called the contravallation, extended for 13 miles and included elaborate obstacles designed to break up enemy attacks. The construction work proceeded under constant harassment from Vercingetorix's forces, who made repeated sorties to disrupt Roman activities. Caesar's soldiers worked with their weapons close at hand, ready to drop their tools and fight at a moment's notice. The combination of backbreaking labor and constant vigilance tested the legion's endurance to its limits, but Caesar's personal example kept morale high, even as the situation became increasingly desperate. The complexity of the Roman siege works at Alesia demonstrated the engineering capabilities that had made Roman armies so formidable throughout the Mediterranean world. The fortifications included not only walls and trenches, but also sophisticated defensive obstacles. Sharpened stakes concealed in pits, iron spikes embedded in wooden blocks, and chevaux de frise designed to channel enemy attacks into killing zones where Roman artillery could be most effective. When the Gallic relief army finally arrived, Caesar found himself in the unique position of being simultaneously the besieger and the besieged. His forces, numbering perhaps 60,000 men, were trapped between Vercingetorix's garrison and a relief force that contemporary sources estimated at over 200,000 warriors. The odds were so overwhelming that some of Caesar's officers suggested attempting a breakout before the tactical situation became completely hopeless. Caesar's response was characteristic of his leadership style throughout the Gallic Wars. Instead of accepting the defensive posture that circumstances seemed to dictate, he chose to seize the initiative through aggressive action that would force his enemies to react to his moves rather than their own plans. The battle that followed was fought on multiple fronts simultaneously, with Caesar personally leading cavalry charges while his infantry held their positions against attacks from both directions. The climax came when Caesar, recognizing that conventional tactics were insufficient to break the deadlock, mounted his horse and led a cavalry charge that struck the relief army at the moment when victory seemed within their grasp. His scarlet cloak made him easily recognizable to both sides, and his appearance on the battlefield at the critical moment inspired his own troops while demoralizing the enemy. The Gallic forces, caught between hammer and anvil, broke and fled in all directions. And so the story flows on, as Caesar achieved what many considered the greatest military victory in Roman history, establishing his reputation as a commander who could overcome any odds through a combination of tactical brilliance and personal courage. The surrender of Vercingetorix marked the effective end of organized resistance to Roman rule in Gaul, though scattered fighting would continue for several more years. The defeated chieftain's decision to surrender himself to save his followers from further suffering revealed the same nobility of character that had made him such a formidable opponent. Caesar treated his captured enemy with respect, understanding that Vercingetorix had fought courageously for his people's independence according to his own code of honor. The immediate aftermath of Alesia saw Caesar's forces spreading throughout Gaul to suppress the remaining pockets of resistance and establish the administrative structures that would transform the conquered territories into a Roman province. The work was methodical and thorough, involving not only military occupation, but also the complex task of integrating Celtic society into the Roman system without destroying the local institutions that made governance possible. Caesar's approach to pacification revealed the same political sophistication that had characterized his earlier dealings with Gallic tribes. He understood that lasting peace required more than military dominance. It demanded the creation of new social structures that would give conquered peoples a stake in Roman success. His settlement included provisions for veteran colonies that would provide security while also demonstrating the benefits of Roman citizenship. Road construction projects that would improve communications and commerce, and legal reforms that preserved valuable Celtic customs within a Roman framework. The wealth that flowed from the Gallic conquests was unprecedented in Roman history, transforming Caesar from a debt-ridden politician into one of the richest men in the ancient world. The gold and silver that filled his military treasury provided funds for generous bonuses to his veterans, magnificent public works in Rome, and the political activities that would be necessary for his return to civilian life. More importantly, the conquest had given him a devoted army that had shared in his victories and would follow him anywhere he chose to lead. But even as Caesar was achieving unprecedented success in Gaul, the political situation in Rome was deteriorating in ways that would ultimately force him to choose between his personal safety and the constitutional traditions he had sworn to uphold. The first triumvirate, which had made his Gallic command possible, was beginning to fracture under the pressure of competing ambitions and personal tragedies that no political alliance could overcome. The first crack in the triumvirate came with the death of Julia, Caesar's beloved daughter and Pompey's wife, who died in childbirth in 54 BCE. The marriage had provided a personal bond that helped to overcome the natural rivalry between two ambitious men, and Julia's death removed an important stabilizing influence on the relationship. Pompey was genuinely grief-stricken by the loss of his young wife, while Caesar mourned both his daughter and the political implications of her passing. The second devastating blow came the following year with the death of Crassus, killed along with most of his army at the Battle of Carrhae, while attempting to win military glory in a campaign against the Parthian Empire. Crassus's death eliminated the third member of the triumvirate and left Caesar and Pompey as the two dominant figures in Roman politics, a situation that made conflict almost inevitable given the nature of Roman competitive culture. As news of these developments reached Caesar in Gaul, he began to understand that his greatest challenges lay not in conquering barbarian tribes, but in navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics upon his return. His enemies in the Senate, led by men like Cato the Younger and Marcus Bibulus, had been working tirelessly to build a case for his prosecution once his proconsular immunity expired. They accused him of exceeding his authority, conducting unauthorized wars, and violating various constitutional provisions during both his consulship and his Gallic campaigns. The charges were not entirely without merit, for Caesar had indeed pushed the boundaries of traditional Roman law in pursuit of his strategic objectives. But the real issue was not legal, but political. His success in Gaul had made him too powerful to be safely accommodated within the existing system, and his enemies preferred to destroy him rather than risk being overshadowed by his achievements. Caesar's response to this mounting pressure revealed the same strategic thinking that had served him so well in military campaigns. He began laying the groundwork for his return to Rome with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his conquest of Gaul. His first priority was to secure election to a second consulship, which would provide him with legal immunity and the authority to implement the reforms that Roman society desperately needed. In time, the path led him onward to the most momentous decision of his life, a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the Roman Republic itself. The crisis that would ultimately destroy the Roman Republic began to develop as Caesar's Gallic command neared its end, and the question of his return to civilian life became urgent. Traditional constitutional practice required that he lay down his military authority and present himself in Rome as a private citizen before standing for election to any new office. This would leave him vulnerable to prosecution by his enemies, who had made it clear that they intended to use the courts to destroy him politically and perhaps physically. Caesar's supporters in Rome, led by tribunes like Mark Antony, attempted to find a constitutional solution that would allow him to stand for the consulship in absentia, remaining with his armies until he could assume his new office with its attendant legal protections. The proposal was not unprecedented, as other successful generals had been granted similar accommodations in the past. But Caesar's opponents recognized that approving such an arrangement would effectively acknowledge his superiority over traditional senatorial authority. The debate over Caesar's future became a proxy war for larger questions about the nature of Roman government and the proper relationship between military commanders and civilian authority. Conservative senators argued that allowing Caesar to bypass normal procedures would set a dangerous precedent that could encourage future generals to hold the state hostage to their personal ambitions. Caesar's supporters responded that the services he had rendered to Rome entitled him to extraordinary consideration, and that his enemies' obvious bias made normal legal procedures unreliable. As the political temperature rose, both sides began to harden their positions in ways that made compromise increasingly difficult. Caesar's opponents convinced that his return would mark the end of traditional republican government, became willing to risk civil war rather than accommodate his demands. Caesar himself, recognizing that submission would mean political death and possible physical destruction, began to prepare for military action against his own government. The point of no return came when the Senate passed its ultimate decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, declaring a state of emergency and authorizing the consuls to take whatever measures were necessary to preserve the state. This ancient formula had been used sparingly in Roman history, typically during foreign invasions or slave rebellions, and its application to Caesar's situation represented an unprecedented escalation of the conflict. Caesar received word of the Senate's action while he was still in Gaul, completing the final administrative details of his conquest and preparing his legions for the march to winter quarters. The news forced him to confront the reality that his political enemies had chosen confrontation over compromise, leaving him with limited options for a peaceful resolution of the crisis. The decision that followed would be remembered as one of the most significant moments in human history, the point at which the Roman Republic began its transformation into the empire that would dominate the ancient world for centuries to come. Standing by the banks of the Rubicon, the small river that marked the boundary between his Gallic province and Italy proper, Caesar faced a choice that would determine not only his own destiny, but the fate of civilization itself. And so the story flows on, as the greatest Roman of his age prepared to cross a threshold from which there could be no return, guided by ambition and necessity in equal measure. The crossing of the Rubicon took place on a cold January night in 49 BCE, when Caesar led a single legion across the shallow waters that separated Gaul from Italy proper. The river itself was insignificant, barely 20 feet wide at its narrowest point, but its symbolic importance was enormous. Roman law forbade any general from bringing armed forces into Italy without explicit senatorial authorization, and Caesar's crossing constituted an act of rebellion that made civil war inevitable. Caesar's famous words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast, were reportedly spoken as he stepped into the frigid waters, though some sources suggest he quoted a line from the Greek playwright Menander, "Let the die be thrown." Whatever his exact words, their meaning was clear. He had committed himself to a course of action from which retreat was impossible, accepting the enormous risks that came with challenging the established order of the Roman world. The legion that accompanied Caesar across the Rubicon was the 13th, a unit that had served with him throughout the Gallic Wars, and whose loyalty to their commander was absolute. These were veterans who had shared in the triumphs at Alesia and countless smaller engagements, men who had grown wealthy from Caesar's generosity and confident in his ability to lead them to victory against any opponent. Their willingness to follow him into civil war demonstrated the personal bonds that Caesar had forged with his troops over years of shared hardship and success. The march through Italy that followed the river crossing was unlike any military campaign in Roman history. Instead of meeting organized resistance, Caesar's small army found itself welcomed as liberators by communities that had grown tired of corrupt governors and oppressive taxation. Town after town opened its gates without resistance, while local militias that had been raised to oppose him often defected to his cause as soon as they encountered his advance guard. The speed of Caesar's advance caught his enemies completely off guard. They had expected him to spend months gathering his scattered legions from winter quarters throughout Gaul, giving them time to organize their defenses and rally support throughout Italy. Instead, he struck with lightning speed, using the tactical mobility that had served him so well against Gallic opponents to seize strategic positions before his enemies could react. Pompey, who had been chosen by the Senate to lead the resistance against Caesar, found himself forced to abandon Rome after less than 3 months of Caesar's campaign. The great general who had conquered the East and earned the title Magnus discovered that his opponent's reputation for invincibility had preceded him, making it impossible to find reliable troops willing to stand against the conqueror of Gaul. The evacuation of Rome was a devastating psychological blow to Caesar's opponents, who had confidently predicted that Italian municipalities would rally to defend traditional authority against a rebellious proconsul. Instead, they found themselves retreating toward southern ports, while Caesar's forces occupied the capital almost without resistance. Caesar's entry into Rome was deliberately restrained, designed to demonstrate his respect for republican institutions even as he wielded unprecedented personal power. He made no attempt to establish a royal court or adopt the trappings of monarchy, instead presenting himself as a loyal Roman who had been forced to take extreme measures to defend himself against factional enemies who had corrupted the normal processes of government. In time, the path led him onward to challenges that would test his political skills as severely as his military talents, as he attempted to govern a state that had been torn apart by civil war. The civil war that followed Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon was fought on a scale that dwarfed the tribal conflicts of Gaul, involving not just Italy, but the entire Mediterranean world, as both sides sought allies and resources to support their cause. Pompey's strategy was to abandon the peninsula temporarily while building up overwhelming forces in the eastern provinces, where his previous conquests had created networks of loyal clients who could provide both troops and financial support. Caesar's response revealed the same strategic insight that had guided his Gallic campaigns. Rather than pursuing Pompey immediately into regions where his enemy held significant advantages, Caesar chose to consolidate his control over the Western territories first, ensuring that his base of operations was secure before launching campaigns in more distant theaters. The Spanish campaign that followed demonstrated Caesar's continued mastery of rapid warfare and tactical innovation. Pompey's lieutenants in Spain commanded experienced legions and held strong defensive positions, but they found themselves outmaneuvered by an opponent who combined superior mobility with intimate knowledge of the terrain from his earlier service in the province. The decisive engagement at Ilerda became a masterpiece of tactical planning that achieved complete victory without a major battle. Caesar's forces surrounded the enemy armies and cut their supply lines, forcing them to surrender when continued resistance became impossible. The captured legions were treated with characteristic generosity, with common soldiers being allowed to return home while officers were given opportunities to join Caesar's cause or retire from active service. But it was the subsequent campaign in Greece that would determine the ultimate outcome of the civil war and establish Caesar's position as the dominant figure in Roman politics. Pompey had used his time in the East effectively, assembling an army that significantly outnumbered Caesar's forces while also building a naval force that controlled most of the Mediterranean shipping lanes. The campaign began badly for Caesar, whose initial attempts to transport his armies across the Adriatic were frustrated by Pompey's naval superiority. Several transport fleets were intercepted and destroyed, forcing Caesar to operate with reduced forces while his enemies grew stronger with each passing month. The situation became so desperate that Caesar personally attempted to cross the storm-tossed waters in a small boat, demonstrating the same personal courage that had inspired his troops throughout his career. The turning point came at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, where Pompey achieved a tactical victory that should have ended the war in his favor. Caesar's forces were defeated and forced to retreat, leaving behind significant quantities of equipment and supplies. For the first time in his military career, Caesar had been outgeneraled by an opponent, and his enemies began to believe that his legendary invincibility was finally broken. But Caesar's response to defeat revealed the resilience that had carried him through the darkest moments of the Gallic rebellion. Instead of accepting the strategic implications of his loss, he regrouped his scattered forces and began planning a new campaign that would draw Pompey away from his coastal strongholds into the interior of Greece, where Roman tactical superiority could be more effectively employed. And so the story flows on, as Caesar learned that even the greatest commanders must sometimes accept temporary defeat in order to achieve ultimate victory. The final confrontation between Caesar and Pompey took place on the plains of Pharsalus in central Greece, where both commanders had assembled their finest troops for a battle that would determine the fate of the Roman world. The armies that faced each other represented the culmination of Roman military development, with veteran legions that had conquered vast territories and earned reputations for invincibility in their respective theaters of operation. Pompey's forces significantly outnumbered Caesar's, with perhaps 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry facing Caesar's 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. More importantly, Pompey's army included many of the finest units in Roman service, legions that had served him faithfully during his eastern conquests and retained complete confidence in their commander's ability to achieve victory. Caesar's army was smaller, but possessed advantages that would prove decisive in the coming battle. His soldiers were veterans of the Gallic Wars who had absolute faith in their commander's tactical abilities, while his officers had learned to function as an integrated team during years of challenging campaigns. Perhaps most importantly, Caesar himself had developed the ability to inspire his troops to extraordinary efforts through personal example and genuine concern for their welfare. The battle itself was decided by Caesar's tactical innovation in responding to Pompey's cavalry superiority. Instead of accepting the traditional deployment that would have left his right flank vulnerable to cavalry attack, Caesar concealed a fourth line of troops behind his main battle formation, positioning them to counter the expected cavalry charge at the critical moment. When Pompey's cavalry finally attacked, confident that they could roll up Caesar's line and achieve a decisive breakthrough, they found themselves facing fresh troops who had been specifically trained to counter mounted attacks. The surprise was complete, and the cavalry retreat exposed Pompey's left flank to a coordinated assault that quickly spread panic throughout his entire army. The defeat at Pharsalus was so complete that it effectively ended Pompey's ability to continue organized resistance. His forces scattered in all directions, with many units surrendering immediately, while others attempted to reach friendly territories where they might regroup for future campaigns. Pompey himself escaped with a small group of supporters, beginning a desperate flight that would eventually lead to his death on the shores of Egypt. Caesar's treatment of his defeated enemies at Pharsalus demonstrated the clemency that would become one of his most celebrated qualities as a ruler. Unlike previous civil wars, which had typically been followed by massive proscription lists and the systematic elimination of political opponents, Caesar chose to forgive most of those who had fought against him, offering them opportunities to participate in the new order he was creating. This policy of clemency was not merely humanitarian, but also practical, reflecting Caesar's understanding that lasting peace required the integration of former enemies into new governmental structures. The Roman elite was too small and too talented to waste on revenge, and Caesar needed their skills and connections to administer the vast territories that had come under his control. The pursuit of Pompey led Caesar to Egypt, where he became involved in the complex dynastic struggles that had torn the ancient kingdom apart for decades. The famous romance with Cleopatra that developed during his Egyptian sojourn was more than personal indulgence. It was a strategic alliance that secured Roman access to Egypt's vast agricultural wealth, while also demonstrating Caesar's ability to work with non-Roman partners when circumstances required. In time, the path led him onward to the final phase of his career, when military victory would give way to the even more challenging task of governing an empire and reforming institutions that had been stretched beyond their original capabilities. Caesar's return to Rome after his victories in the Civil War marked the beginning of a new era in which traditional republican institutions would be gradually transformed into the imperial system that would govern the Roman world for centuries to come. The changes he implemented were presented as temporary expedients necessitated by the crisis of civil war, but they established precedents that would prove impossible to reverse once the immediate emergency had passed. His first priority was the restoration of order and confidence throughout the territories that had been disrupted by years of warfare. Veterans needed to be settled on lands that would provide them with security while also contributing to the agricultural production that fed Rome's growing population. Provincial governors needed to be chosen for their competence and integrity rather than their political connections, ensuring that distant territories would be administered fairly and efficiently. The debt crisis that had contributed to the Civil War required immediate attention, as thousands of Roman citizens faced ruin from obligations they couldn't meet. Caesar's solution combined practical relief measures with longer-term reforms designed to prevent similar crises in the future. He provided for partial debt forgiveness, while also establishing new regulations for lending practices that would protect borrowers from exploitation by unscrupulous creditors. Perhaps most importantly, Caesar began the process of expanding Roman citizenship to deserving individuals and communities throughout the empire. Recognizing that the old distinction between Romans and foreigners was becoming increasingly meaningless in a world where non-Italians often served with distinction in Roman armies and administration. His grants of citizenship to Gallic chieftains and Spanish municipalities represented the beginning of a transformation that would eventually make Rome a truly cosmopolitan empire. The calendar reform that Caesar implemented during this period demonstrated his attention to seemingly mundane details that could have far-reaching practical consequences. The traditional Roman calendar had become so out of alignment with the actual solar year that religious festivals were occurring in the wrong seasons, disrupting agricultural schedules and creating confusion throughout the empire. Caesar's new calendar, based on Egyptian astronomical knowledge, corrected these problems and established a system that would remain in use for over 15 centuries. His building projects in Rome itself were designed not only to provide employment for the urban masses, but also to create monuments that would demonstrate the power and permanence of his new order. The Forum Julium, with its temple to Venus Genetrix, honoring the goddess from whom the Julian family claimed descent, served as both religious center and political statement about the divine favor that supported Caesar's rule. The public games and spectacles that Caesar sponsored reached unprecedented levels of magnificence, featuring gladiatorial contests, wild beast hunts, and theatrical performances that entertained hundreds of thousands of spectators, while also demonstrating the resources at his disposal. These events were more than mere entertainment. They were carefully orchestrated displays of power that communicated political messages to audiences who might never participate directly in governmental processes. But even as Caesar achieved remarkable success in addressing the practical problems that faced Roman society, he also created new tensions that would ultimately threaten everything he had accomplished. His accumulation of honors and titles, though always presented as reluctant acceptance of necessary burdens, began to alarm traditionalists who saw in them the trappings of monarchy that Romans had rejected centuries earlier. And so, the story flows on, as Caesar discovered that success in governing an empire could create enemies as dangerous as any he had faced on the battlefields of Gaul or Greece. The conspiracy that would ultimately cost Caesar his life began to form among men who had benefited from his clemency, but could not reconcile themselves to the reality of his supreme power. Many of the conspirators were former enemies who had been pardoned after Pharsalus, while others were long-time supporters who had become convinced that Caesar's continued rule threatened the republican institutions they had sworn to defend. Marcus Junius Brutus, perhaps the most famous of the conspirators, exemplified the complex motivations that drove the plot against Caesar. He was descended from the legendary founder of the Roman Republic, who had expelled the last king and established the constitutional system that the conspirators claimed to be defending. More personally, Brutus had been treated by Caesar almost as a son, receiving honors and responsibilities that reflected genuine affection and trust. The psychological burden of contemplating action against Caesar was enormous for men like Brutus, who understood that they were planning not only political assassination, but also personal betrayal of someone who had shown them nothing but kindness. The conspirators had to convince themselves that their duty to the state transcended personal loyalty, that Caesar's death was necessary to preserve freedoms that his continued life would inevitably destroy. The plot developed slowly over many months as the conspirators carefully recruited new members while avoiding detection by Caesar's extensive intelligence network. They understood that their success would depend not only on killing Caesar, but also on having a plan for what would follow his death, a way of restoring republican government that would justify their extreme actions. Caesar himself seems to have been aware that plots were developing against him, but his response was characteristically bold rather than cautious. he dismissed his bodyguard, claiming that a leader who needed protection from his own citizens was not worthy of rule. He continued to appear in public regularly, attending Senate meetings and social events where potential assassins could easily approach him. Some historians have suggested that Caesar was growing tired of the burdens of supreme power and perhaps welcomed the prospect of release from responsibilities that had consumed his entire adult life. Others argue that his apparent carelessness reflected supreme confidence in his ability to handle any threat through personal charisma and political skill. The truth probably combined elements of both explanations, as Caesar faced the challenge of governing an empire while maintaining the illusion that he was simply first among equals in a restored republic. The final weeks before the assassination were marked by an increasing number of omens and warnings that Caesar chose to ignore despite the urgings of his wife Calpurnia and other close associates. Soothsayers warned him to beware the Ides of March, while friends reported disturbing dreams and strange occurrences that seemed to foretell disaster. Caesar's dismissal of these warnings reflected both his rational skepticism about superstition and his fatalistic acceptance that great men must sometimes face great risks. The morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, dawned clear and cold in Rome, with frost covering the city's rooftops and a gentle breeze stirring the banners that hung from public buildings. Caesar woke early in his house on the Palatine Hill, surrounded by the familiar sounds of a great city stirring to life. The distant murmur of conversation from the streets below, the creaking of cartwheels on stone pavements, the calls of vendors setting up their stalls in the nearby forum. In time, the path led him onward to his final appointment with destiny, walking through streets he had known since childhood, toward a confrontation that would echo through the centuries. The Senate meeting that had been called for the Ides of March was to take place in the theatre of Pompey, since the regular Senate House was undergoing repairs. The irony of the location, Caesar's enemies gathering in a building dedicated to his greatest rival, was not lost on those who knew the full story of recent events. As Caesar made his way through the morning streets, accompanied by a small retinue of friends and clients, he encountered several individuals who attempted to warn him of the danger that awaited. Artemidorus, a Greek teacher of rhetoric who had learned of the plot through his connections among the conspirators, pressed a scroll into Caesar's hands that contained detailed information about the planned assassination. Caesar accepted the document, but became distracted by other petitioners and never found an opportunity to read it. The scroll was still in his hand when he entered the theatre, a final chance for survival that circumstances prevented him from taking. The conspirators had positioned themselves strategically throughout the meeting hall, with some blocking potential escape routes, while others prepared to strike when the signal was given. Their plan called for Brutus to deliver the first blow, both because of his symbolic importance as descendant of the Republic's founder, and because his action would commit him irrevocably to their cause. When Caesar took his seat in the curule chair that marked his position as dictator, the conspirators approached under the pretense of presenting a petition for the recall of Publius Cimber, one of Brutus's brothers who had been exiled for political activities. The request was reasonable enough to avoid suspicion, while also providing cover for the assassins to gather closely around their target. Caesar's response to the petition was characteristically direct. He refused to consider the recall, stating that decisions made through proper legal procedures should not be reversed through private appeals. His refusal provided the signal the conspirators had been waiting for, and Casca struck the first blow with a dagger that wounded but did not seriously injure the dictator. What followed was a frenzied attack that bore little resemblance to the dignified political action the conspirators had envisioned. Caesar fought back vigorously, striking at his attackers with the stylus he had been using to take notes and attempting to break free from the circle of assailants that surrounded him. The scene was chaotic and bloody, more like a street brawl than the solemn execution of justice the plotters had intended. The moment that broke Caesar's resistance came when he saw Brutus among his attackers, dagger in hand and determined to strike a blow for Republican freedom. The sight of his protégé among his enemies seems to have destroyed Caesar's will to continue fighting, leading to his famous last words, "Et tu, Brute," and "you, Brutus." With that recognition of ultimate betrayal, Caesar ceased his resistance and allowed the conspirators to complete their work. The great Julius Caesar died at the base of Pompey's statue, in a pool of blood that stained the marble floor of the theatre, where his former rival had once received the applause of admiring crowds. His body bore 23 wounds, though the autopsy revealed that only one had been immediately fatal. The conspirators had succeeded in killing the most powerful man in the world, but they would soon discover that ending Caesar's life was far easier than ending his influence. And so, the story flows on, as the death of one man unleashed forces that would transform the ancient world in ways the assassins had never intended or imagined. The immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination was chaos that revealed how completely the conspirators had failed to plan for what would follow their dramatic action. They had assumed that killing the dictator would automatically restore Republican government, but they discovered instead that Roman society had been so transformed by decades of civil war and autocratic rule that a simple return to traditional practices was impossible. The conspirators' first mistake was their failure to secure the support of Mark Antony, Caesar's most capable lieutenant, who had been detained outside the theatre during the assassination by conspirators assigned to prevent his intervention. When Antony learned of Caesar's death, he immediately began organizing the Caesarian party for what would inevitably become a struggle for control of the state. His possession of Caesar's private papers and treasury gave him enormous advantages in the political maneuvering that followed. The reading of Caesar's will provided another shock to the conspirators and a propaganda victory for his supporters. Caesar had left substantial bequests to every Roman citizen, while also bequeathing his private gardens to the people as a public park. These provisions demonstrated his continued concern for popular welfare, even in death, while also suggesting that he had been planning for the future rather than seeking to establish a permanent tyranny. Perhaps most importantly, the will named Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew, as his adopted son and heir. The young man would eventually become the Emperor Augustus, but at the time of Caesar's death, he seemed an unlikely candidate to inherit the leadership of the Caesarian party. His youth, limited political experience, and lack of military credentials made him appear to be little more than a placeholder who could be easily manipulated by more experienced politicians. The funeral that followed became a defining moment in Roman political theatre, as Antony's eulogy transformed public opinion about the assassination and its perpetrators. Speaking from the rostrum, where Caesar himself had delivered so many memorable speeches, Antony reminded the crowd of the dictator's achievements: his conquest of Gaul, his victories in the Civil War, his generous treatment of enemies, and his efforts to address the problems that plagued Roman society. When Antony displayed Caesar's blood-stained toga and pointed to each rent made by the conspirators' daggers, the crowd's mood shifted from grief to rage. The senators who had claimed to be liberating Rome were now seen as murderers who had destroyed a benefactor of the people. Rioting broke out throughout the city, forcing the conspirators to flee for their lives while their houses were attacked by angry mobs. The cremation of Caesar's body took place in the Forum, where the crowd built an impromptu pyre from whatever materials they could find. The flames that consumed the dictator's remains also marked the beginning of a new phase of civil war that would rage for over a decade before finally ending with the establishment of the Principate under Augustus. The irony of the situation was not lost on thoughtful observers. The conspirators had killed Caesar to save the Republic, but their action had made the restoration of republican government more difficult than ever. The precedent of political assassination would encourage future violence, while the martyrdom of Caesar would provide a powerful symbol for those who sought to continue his work of imperial expansion and social reform. In time, the path led him onward to immortality, as Caesar's name became synonymous with imperial power, and his legacy shaped the development of Western civilization for centuries to come. The transformation of Caesar from mortal politician to legendary figure began almost immediately after his death, as supporters and enemies alike recognized that his influence would continue long after his physical presence had ended. The comet that appeared in the skies during the Games held to honor his memory was interpreted by many Romans as proof that Caesar had been received among the gods, a belief that his heir Octavian would later formalize through official deification. The Caesarian party that emerged from the chaos following the assassination proved remarkably durable, surviving the conflicts between Antony and Octavian that dominated the next phase of Roman civil war. Even when the two men became bitter enemies, both continued to claim Caesar's legacy and to present themselves as the true inheritors of his vision for Rome's future. Their eventual conflict at the Battle of Actium was fought not over whether Caesar's work should continue, but over who had the right to complete it. Augustus, as Octavian became known after his victory over Antony, proved to be a worthy successor, who combined Caesar's political skills with a more cautious approach to constitutional innovation. The Principate that he established preserved the forms of republican government while concentrating real power in the hands of a single ruler, a compromise that provided the stability Rome needed while avoiding the appearance of monarchy that had cost Caesar his life. The military reforms that Caesar had begun were completed by Augustus and his successors, creating professional legions that could maintain order throughout the vast territories of the empire, while also providing opportunities for ambitious men to advance through merit rather than birth. The roads, aqueducts, and public buildings that marked Roman civilization throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia reflected engineering principles and administrative practices that Caesar had pioneered during his governorships and campaigns. Perhaps most importantly, the concept of Roman citizenship that Caesar had begun to expand became the foundation of a truly cosmopolitan empire where talent and loyalty mattered more than ethnic origin or place of birth. The Spanish, Gallic, and African soldiers who rose to prominence in later Roman armies were following paths that Caesar had first opened during his provincial commands and civil war campaigns. The literary tradition that preserved Caesar's memory was equally important in establishing his lasting influence. His own commentaries on the Gallic and civil wars became models of clear, direct prose that influenced historical writing for centuries. The speeches and letters that Cicero and other contemporaries preserved provided intimate glimpses of Caesar's personality and thinking that kept his memory alive long after the political issues of his time had been forgotten. Later historians, from Suetonius and Plutarch to modern scholars, have continued to find in Caesar's career lessons about leadership, ambition, and the relationship between individual genius and historical circumstances. His ability to inspire personal loyalty, to adapt to changing situations, and to pursue long-term goals despite immediate obstacles has made him a subject of study for military officers, political leaders, and students of human nature. The languages that developed from Latin carried Caesar's name into every corner of the known world, while the calendar he reformed continued to regulate daily life for over 15 centuries. The title Caesar itself became synonymous with imperial authority, adopted by rulers from the German Kaisers to the Russian Tsars, who claimed to inherit his mantle of universal dominion. And so the story flows on, as Caesar's influence spread far beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire to shape the development of Western civilization and provide inspiration for countless individuals who faced their own moments of decision between safety and greatness. As we near the end of our quiet journey through Caesar's remarkable life, it is worth reflecting on the enduring lessons that his story offers to those who seek to understand the complex relationship between individual ambition and historical change. Caesar lived during a time when the old certainties were crumbling and new possibilities were emerging, a situation that required extraordinary vision and courage to navigate successfully. His early life demonstrated the importance of thorough preparation and continuous learning, as he mastered the skills of oratory, law, and military command that would later serve him so well in positions of supreme responsibility. His willingness to take calculated risks, from his defiance of Sulla to his crossing of the Rubicon, showed how great achievements often require bold action in the face of uncertain outcomes. The Gallic Wars revealed his ability to adapt his methods to changing circumstances while never losing sight of his ultimate objectives. His treatment of conquered peoples, combining firm control with generous opportunities for advancement, established patterns of imperial administration that would endure for centuries. His personal relationships with his soldiers showed how effective leadership requires genuine concern for the welfare of those who serve under you. The civil war that followed demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers inherent in challenging established authority. Caesar's victory proved that traditional institutions could be overcome by superior organization and more compelling vision, but the cost in blood and treasure was enormous. His clemency toward defeated enemies showed that magnanimity in victory could be more powerful than vengeance, though it also revealed the risks that come with trusting those who have reason to resent your success. Caesar's brief period as dictator illustrated the challenges facing anyone who attempts to reform institutions that have outlived their usefulness while still maintaining popular support and constitutional legitimacy. His assassination demonstrated the tragic consequences that can follow when reformers move too quickly for their societies to accept. But it also showed how ideas can prove more durable than the individuals who conceive them. The subsequent history of the Roman Empire proved that Caesar's vision of a cosmopolitan state governed by merit rather than birth was achievable, but only through the patient work of multiple generations who built upon the foundations he had laid. The transformation of Rome from a city-state ruling an empire through force into a genuine commonwealth, where diverse peoples could participate as equals, required centuries of gradual development. In our own time, when established institutions face challenges that require bold leadership and innovative solutions, Caesar's example offers both inspiration and warning. His achievements show what determined individuals can accomplish when they combine vision with practical skills. But his fate reminds us that even the most successful reformers must navigate carefully between the need for change and the human desire for continuity. The quiet courage that Caesar displayed throughout his career, from his early defiance of Sulla to his final dismissal of bodyguards, suggests that true greatness often requires accepting risks that more cautious individuals would avoid. His willingness to trust his destiny to fortune while doing everything possible to influence the outcome through preparation and skill provides a model for anyone who seeks to achieve something beyond the ordinary. As we close this gentle exploration of Caesar's life and legacy, let us remember his own words about the relationship between creation and learning. Wisdom that seems especially appropriate for those who seek rest and renewal through contemplation of the past. For in studying the lives of remarkable individuals like Caesar, we participate in the ongoing conversation between past and present that enriches our understanding of human possibility. In the words of Caesar himself, words that seem to echo softly across the centuries with their timeless wisdom, "It is better to create than to learn. Creating is the essence of life." And with these gentle words of wisdom from one of history's most remarkable figures, our journey through the rise and fall of Julius Caesar comes to its peaceful conclusion. May his story bring you rest, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet grandeur of ancient Rome beneath starlit skies. Sleep well, dear travelers. Sleep well.